There are moments when certain thoughts seem inevitable, almost like an invasion in the middle of silence. They start subtly, often as an attempt to process a persistent feeling of discomfort or that inner desert that seems impossible to cross. Over time, these ruminations transform into patterns, and what once seemed like a search for understanding ends up becoming a vicious cycle. The quest for mental control and a brief sensation of clarity gradually becomes a destructive war. But what's really behind this cycle? And have you ever wondered why some people seem to sink into these internal battles with no possible return, while others mysteriously find a way out? The truth is that these mental patterns are frequently an expression of a deeper wound. They are attempts to protect a self that seems impossible to protect. The person isn't just fighting for peace or immediate relief, but for the need to reconnect with something that's missing, even if on the surface this looks like self-sabotage. What's at stake is a hidden search for balance, an attempt to win an invisible war that escapes conscious control. Mental exhaustion is one of the most complex and challenging issues of the human psyche. In our society, it presents itself in various forms, from chronic states of alertness to compulsive rumination cycles that often hide a deep, empty core. What's behind this almost uncontrollable need to fight against one's own mind? Is it just a matter of lack of mental discipline, or is there something deeper, something most of us don't see? In this material, we're going to explore the mental war through the lens of deep psychological concepts, investigating how exhaustion manifests itself, and why sometimes it becomes a labyrinth from which it seems impossible to escape. We'll see that our psychic automatisms aren't just responses to external factors, but reflections of unresolved internal conflicts. Our goal here is to better understand the tired mind, not just as a behavioral problem, but as a symptom of something deeper. The invisible war that nobody sees isn't simply a character flaw or a moral weakness, but an expression of the human psyche in imbalance. We can understand that mental conflicts, in their essence, are forms of escape, attempts to deal with psychological suffering or with a lack of existential meaning. When an individual can't confront their own internal issues, they may seek relief in obsessive thought patterns that end up offering a temporary solution to a deeper pain. The mind can be seen as a totality, a complex network of conscious and unconscious aspects. When someone falls into this internal war, it's often an unconscious attempt to fill an inner void. This void can arise in various forms, from spiritual disconnection, from emotional fragmentation, or from aspects of personality that weren't recognized or accepted. This mental battle can also be seen as a form of escape from reality. In moments of stress, anguish, or existential crisis, the individual may take refuge in ruminations or compulsive mental behaviors as an attempt to escape life's pressures. However, this escape is never permanent, and the return to full consciousness is usually even more difficult. This generates a vicious cycle where the mental struggle doesn't solve the problem, but only makes it worse. We can define mental exhaustion as any pattern of repeated thinking, related to worries or not, in which the person feels obligated to persist, regardless of the negative impact this has on their life and on the lives of others. When we think about mental conflicts, it's common to focus on manifestations like anxiety or depressive states. However, the tyranny of thoughts can also manifest in subtle ways and can be equally devastating to an individual's life. The compulsive use of mental rumination, constant social comparison, severe self-criticism, or even activities like excessive planning can potentially become destructive patterns. How can we distinguish between productive thinking and destructive thinking? The central question is, who's in command? The individual or their thoughts? It's possible to master a reflection, but an obsessive reflection that the person can't control is a destructive pattern. If you have doubts, ask a simple question. Given the damage you're causing yourself and others with these mental patterns, would you be willing to stop? If the answer is no, you're trapped in a cycle. And if you can't give up the behavior or keep your promise to change, then you've fallen into this psychological self-cannibalism. There's been a long debate about what causes this mental exhaustion. While some explain the problem as something that resides in people, a more accurate explanation is that the mental war is the result of the interaction between the individual and the environment. This battle arises when an individual regularly yearns for a change in their subjective state or sense of being and becomes dependent on thought patterns to generate that desired experiential change. Just as certain individuals are more vulnerable to mental exhaustion, it's also true that some environments, due to their structural and cultural characteristics, have more potential to trigger or accelerate this state. Their distinct potency lies in the capacity to generate the kind of convincing cognitive overload that some people end up depending on. Given that we are and always will be surrounded by environments and situations with stressful potential, let's explore the personal side of the equation and investigate what makes some people more susceptible to mental war than others. All mental exhaustion, whether severe or mild, event-related or thought-related, is an attempt to find relief from suffering and emotional pain. Mental conflicts always have their origin in suffering, whether visible or hidden in the unconscious. Much more than a search for peace, chronic mental struggle is the individual's attempt to escape from pain. The forms of pain that lead a person to mental war are numerous and varied. Some develop these patterns as a way to deal with depressive states, insecurities, or manifestations of intense anxiety. Others, to face highly stressful jobs or relationships. And still others, to avoid the suffering of lack of purpose or the feeling of helplessness before the empty core of their lives. If you're enjoying this content, you might also like our exclusive material that's in the first pinned comment. We could imagine a conversation with someone who has been waging this internal battle for years. If we asked why they continue in this war, the answer could be, I don't know. I'm just trying to fill a void in my life. Boredom. Simply lack of direction. In many cases, the emotional pain that one seeks to process through this mental struggle has roots in the past, especially in childhood. Studies show that many people who develop severe mental exhaustion patterns grew up in emotionally challenging environments. As has been observed, all parental difficulties leave themselves, without fail, in the child's psyche, sometimes with results that deeply affect adult life. The influence of parents on the child's development and their susceptibility to mental conflicts in adult life cannot be underestimated. Just as the baby in the womb is immersed in and completely dependent on the mother's body, in the first years of life, when the brain is most malleable, the child is emotionally and psychologically fused with the parents. A dysfunctional childhood, carrying the pain of emotional neglect or harmful parental dynamics, suppresses the deep suffering of emotional disorder in the child's mind and alters brain development in ways that increase the likelihood of mental conflicts. Many adults who struggle with their minds say that ruminating is a way to process their emotional pain, but more than that, their brain development was compromised by their experiences. The developing brain, under chronic stress, is like a plant in the shade. It molds itself to survive emotional scarcity, growing with oversized alert circuits and underdeveloped reward systems. The dopamine and opioid systems, the limbic brain responsible for emotions, the stress system, and the impulse control areas of the cortex simply cannot develop normally under such circumstances. This creates the perfect biological terrain for mental war. But it's not just childhood trauma that makes a person more susceptible to mental war. Children who grew up with emotionally cold or distant caregivers are also much more likely to develop these patterns in adult life. This situation of parental emotional absence can be called proximate separation. The parent is physically present and satisfies all the child's physical needs. However, due to stress, depressive states, or other internal demons, the parent doesn't nurture the child psychologically or emotionally. A child can also feel emotional distress when the parent is physically present but emotionally absent. Under normal circumstances, a child who perceives this emotional separation will seek to reconnect with the parent. If the parent doesn't respond or doesn't respond adequately, the child will develop inadequate coping mechanisms, such as mental rumination or severe self-criticism, as forms of emotional processing, or they'll simply disconnect to escape the distress. Children who didn't receive their parents' attentive presence are at higher risk of seeking relief through destructive mental patterns later in life. But currently, even people who had a nurturing childhood aren't completely immune to mental exhaustion. Because just as during periods of great social changes, when people en masse turn to escape mechanisms to relieve the distress provoked by a culture in transformation, nowadays many resort to destructive mental patterns as a way to deal with the feeling of helplessness stimulated by an uncertain vision of society's future. Furthermore, the fact that to conform to the modern world, it's necessary to be constantly connected and compulsively use technology, social media, and entertainment as means to escape from feelings of emptiness and spiritual disconnection results in the perfect social storm that has created a mental health crisis. A sense of chronic emptiness permeates our entire culture. Those in mental war are more painfully aware of this emptiness than most people. Many of us resemble these people in our ineffective efforts to fill the spiritual black hole at the center, where we've lost contact with our souls and our spirit, with those sources of meaning and value that aren't contingent or ephemeral. Our consumerist culture, obsessed with acquisition, action, and image, only serves to deepen the hole, leaving us emptier than before. Given the number of people who grow up in emotionally absent homes, along with society's state of overload, it's no surprise that many resort to destructive mental patterns as a way to cope with life. This movement isn't entirely irrational or ineffective, because these patterns work, at least temporarily. They're very effective at creating an illusion of control over suffering and emotional pain. Someone could explain the reason why they continue in this war. It's to not feel the feelings I feel when I stop fighting. These patterns aren't only effective at providing a sense of relief from suffering. Mental indulgence can also temporarily elevate someone from the monotony or misery of daily life and take them to experiences charged with intensity, even if painful. At the beginning of the 20th century, it was observed that certain mental states not only relieve tension, but can also induce a state similar to an experience of clarity, at least until mental exhaustion affects the mind and body destructively. We could paraphrase, the dominion of mental war over humanity is due, undoubtedly, to the deepest mystery of existence, to the fact that glimpses of something we immediately recognize as control are granted to us only in the initial and fleeting phases of what, in totality, is such an exhausting process. Although these patterns may work in the short term, by depending on shortcuts to emotional relief, a price is paid over time. The more we persist in this war, the more our dependence grows, and the more we need these patterns to feel any sensation of stability. Slowly but surely, the mental struggle becomes the focal point of our lives, while everything else that could provide lasting satisfaction, our health, relationships, creativity, career, and life purpose, fades into the periphery. Furthermore, mental exhaustion alters the brain's structure in ways that undermine our capacity for voluntary control. When we're trapped in the control of this war, we often find ourselves in what can be called brain lock, which makes our actions follow our destructive mental impulses, while part of our mind watches attentively, unable to do anything, knowing full well that we're destroying our mind, body, and potential. Given the strong grip of this mental war, the vital question arises: what's the possibility of winning this battle? The problem in facing any attempt at a renewed life free from this struggle is that the same mechanism that needs to heal the brain is what's damaged. The more intense the mental war, the greater the brain alteration, and the greater the biological obstacles to achieving peace. Fortunately, our brains are remarkably resilient. Even in adult life, it's possible for the brain to restructure itself in ways that make it possible to live, perhaps for the first time, a full, healthy life free from this constant war. This brings us to three fundamental pillars that can interrupt this cycle. Three paths that, when traveled together, transform the relationship with one's own mind. First pillar: awareness, the observer. The process of overcoming any destructive mental pattern begins with awareness. This brings us to an interesting concept: observing awareness. This form of consciousness can interrupt the cycle of mental war because, instead of succumbing to the polarities of control and chaos, anxiety and temporary relief, it allows the person to experience the full spectrum of human experience with deep equanimity. Imagine you're at the top of a mountain, watching a storm happening in the valley below. Lightning strikes, the wind howls. But you, up there, aren't being hit by the storm. You see, but you're not dragged along. This is observing awareness. Without the capacity to look within and recognize one's own internal mechanisms, the individual is condemned to repeat the same behaviors without perceiving the origin of their problems. This awareness process is a crucial step for transformation, because it allows the individual to perceive that the mental war isn't the solution, but an escape from the true psychological problem. And you can practice this now. The next time a rumination cycle begins, instead of diving into it or fighting against it, try doing the simple and difficult exercise of asking yourself, what emotion am I trying not to feel right now? Often, the war is a detour. This question takes you off the battlefield and leads you to the source of the wound. The first step toward overcoming this war, then, is to recognize its existence and the impact it has on the individual's life. This may seem simple, but many people find themselves trapped in the vicious cycle of denial for years, never deeply questioning the reasons that lead them to wage this internal battle. When the mental war is finally recognized as a temporary solution to a greater pain, the healing process can begin. Second pillar: integration, the inner journey. From this point, the individual must reflect on the aspects of their life that led them to this state. Reflection is essential because, without it, the person can't understand the deep causes of their behaviors. The human psyche is full of layers of complexes and symbols that often remain hidden until the individual is willing to look within themselves. The mental war is a symbolic manifestation of what's hidden in the psyche, an unconscious attempt to deal with suffering and with internal shadows. When the person begins to reflect on their mental war, they're actually beginning to walk the path of integration. Integration is the process of bringing together all aspects of the psyche, both positive and negative, into a totality. This means looking at the shadow and at the repressed aspects, without judgments, but with a willingness to understand what these aspects have to teach. This process of self-knowledge and reflection can be painful, but it's also the key to liberation. It's like being lost in a labyrinth. The first reaction is to run, to try to find the exit quickly. But true wisdom comes when you stop, touch the walls, understand the structure of the labyrinth. And then you realize you're not just inside the labyrinth, you also are the labyrinth. Your patterns, your fears, your defenses, all of this makes up the structure. And when you understand this, the labyrinth loses its power over you. In the case of mental war, reflection helps the person identify thought patterns and emotions that sustain destructive behavior. For example, someone may realize that mental rumination has become a way to face loneliness or lack of purpose. The war, in this case, isn't just about thoughts, but about what they represent, a defense mechanism against emotional suffering. When the person manages to reflect on this, they can begin to seek healthier ways to deal with their emotions and their loneliness, replacing the war with more constructive behaviors. Practically every mental action we take is an attempt to solve the problem of the self. And mental war is no different. It's just a more extreme form of repetitive action, creating deep neurological trails in the brain. Over time, these trails become so deep that they become almost inevitable, and, at a certain point, seem inescapable. Both psychological perspectives and consciousness concepts approach mental war similarly. Both suggest that the solution to the problem passes through the transcendence of the separate self, or the pain and contradiction of the ego. However, there's a specific approach, seeking to integrate the different aspects of the psyche. When this happens, the self stops being at war with itself, and thus the person experiences a sensation of self-transcendent wholeness, which initiates an awakening and a radical change in consciousness. This change in consciousness is so profound that it also transforms patterns of destructive mental behavior. The most common mistake people make when dealing with mental war is thinking it's simply a matter of lack of willpower. In reality, mental war is exactly the opposite of that. It is, in fact, a reflection of the recognition that the problem goes beyond a simple failure of personal resolution. This doesn't diminish individual responsibility, but recognizes the need for a power that's beyond personal power. Third pillar: connection, the outer bridge. But this journey of self-knowledge, however interior it may be, doesn't need to, and shouldn't, be solitary. Because if disconnection fed the war, genuine connection can be the foundation of healing. This brings us to a fundamental pillar: social support. If someone truly wants to escape the clutches of this war, although the overcoming process is, ultimately, an inner journey, social support plays a crucial role in healing. It's recognized that human beings are, by nature, social beings, and that the psyche is deeply influenced by relationships with others. This means that, although mental war often has roots in internal conflicts, it's also related to social and cultural dynamics that can reinforce or hinder healing. In other words, the journey of overcoming mental war can't be done in isolation. It's essential to have the support of others to promote transformation and complete healing. Human beings develop within a network of relationships, both personal and collective. These relationships have a profound impact on the individual, shaping their psyche significantly. In the context of mental war, this means that the social environment, friendships, family, and even the broader structures of society can facilitate or hinder the healing process. Mental war often takes root in emotional or social isolation, in which the individual disconnects from the people around them, whether due to shame, fear of judgment, or the perception that they can't be understood. The healing journey from mental war, therefore, must be accompanied by a process of social reintegration. This implies reconnecting with community, with friends and family, and creating new support networks. Healthy social relationships can offer a space of understanding, acceptance, and growth, essential elements for recovery. However, not all relationships are positive, and it's fundamental that the individual distance themselves from influences that may feed the mental war, or that reinforce self-destructive behaviors. The integration process thus involves a conscious selection of people and environments that are most beneficial for growth and healing. Social support isn't limited to friends and family. Many support programs, support groups, or therapeutic communities offer a network that can be equally powerful. In these groups, individuals facing similar challenges come together to share their experiences, difficulties, and victories. The simple act of listening and being heard can have a significant healing effect. It's understood that collective experiences, shared narratives, help the individual feel they're not alone in their struggle, providing a sense of belonging that's essential for healing. Deep down, mental war is a deeply dysfunctional attempt to solve a spiritual problem, a problem shared by most people, whether or not they're in conscious conflict with themselves. Not all stories have a happy ending, but the discoveries of science, the teachings of the heart, and the revelations of the soul assure us that no human being is ever beyond the possibility of finding peace. And so, the same silence that was once invaded by thoughts of war can gradually become the space where you finally listen to yourself, no longer as an enemy to be defeated, but as a territory to be reconquered with gentleness, with patience, with compassion. Peace, then, stops being a fragile truce that can break at any moment and becomes a presence, a way of inhabiting your own mind without constantly being on alert, without needing to fight, without needing to prove anything. The labyrinth seen from above reveals a path. The storm in the valley eventually passes, and you, the observer on the mountain, realize you've always had the capacity to simply witness, to simply be, without needing to be at war all the time. If you've made it this far, if you really paid attention and absorbed these reflections, consider doing something meaningful for yourself now. Subscribe to the channel, turn on notifications so you don't miss upcoming content, and leave your like. It's not just support for the channel, although that's also important. It's a tangible reminder to yourself that you're consciously choosing content that makes you think more deeply, that helps you better understand the mechanisms of your own mind, that contributes to your genuine growth. And that matters profoundly. Your mental well-being matters. You matter.